And a lot of the groups that have helped put this together are the student groups. And this is a first for so many student groups to be working together and making this happen. The student groups include the Wildlife Diseases Association Student Chapter, the Student One Health Association, which we call SOHA, from the College of Medicine, from the School of Public Health, from the College of Vet Medicine, Vets Without Borders, and the Institute of Infectious Animal Diseases, and then the One Health program. So we want to say thank you to the students to show us how this can be done in terms of multidisciplinary and One Health. So our speaker today is a veterinarian and a wildlife biologist. His current position is with the Food and Agriculture Organization, and he is a senior technical coordinator for the Emergency Center for Transboundary Animal Diseases in Viet Nam. He facilitates a One Health approach, and that means combining agriculture, public health, and natural resource management. His background is extensive. He has a very wide, a lot of metrics in terms of his more than 100 scientific publications. He's worked in 50 countries in Africa, Asia, the Americas. He is really, what we're excited about today is he's working on the focus area of livestock, wildlife, human, and the ecosystem. A little fun fact before he takes over, and that is that not only is he passionate about One Health, but he's also, that was a good entry point. He's also a soccer coach. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Scott Newman.
We're back in business. Okay. I think probably many of you are aware that of all the human infections that are taking place these days, roughly about 60% of them are coming from animals, and of those, roughly 70% are actually coming from wildlife. So this sort of paints a picture that wildlife is the bad guy. And I hope by the end of this presentation that maybe you won't think that, and that you'll be able to explain to people that that's actually not the case. So if I don't accomplish that in today's presentation, please ask me at the end so I can clarify that. But I think one of the issues that we recognize is that our health and human health is very much dependent on the health of the environment that we live in, the food that we eat, which comes from the resources around us. And so the old adage, you are what you eat, is very much true from a One Health standpoint. The other things that I think are important to focus on and remember is that many people talk about the emerging pandemic threats, right? This is the big, sexy looking catchphrase that's used for different attention attractors. But you also have to remember that One Health very much applies to these diseases that are also endemic and long-term chronic diseases. So I hope that you don't think of this as only an approach to deal with emerging diseases, because it very much applies to addressing a lot of the sort of chronic disease burdens that are out there. And I think that what we all are aiming for is trying to move towards early detection and early response, which then allows you to mitigate the impact of things. And obviously, you know, at the bottom of this, what is causing these events? What is causing these problems? So we can't just treat every time the problem that we're dealing with. What we need to do is move further upstream and understand what's causing the problems and address the problems before they actually become problems. So we're trying to move, if you're thinking about an epidemiological curve, you're trying to move further to the left on the curve so that it doesn't have much impact or much effect, and you've caught it early and you respond early. But in many cases, I think the public health issues that ultimately arise are in many cases actually completely preventable. And that, I think, is the real charm of doing a One Health approach. If you can understand the drivers and mitigate the problem before it even shows up, then you've really succeeded. And I think that's where we want to strive to go. As you most people are aware that a lot of the health problems are very dynamic, they're complicated, it's not a simple solution. We really require multiple sectors and disciplines to address them, and there's not a single profession that is prepared to do it alone. And if you look at what many people refer to as One Health, this is one example of One Health, right? Many people just say it's the linkage between animal health and human health professionals work together. I actually have also heard, and this is maybe a more common understanding of One Health, it's animal health and human health, which is positioned within an ecological system. But I think that we need to be a little more thorough, and where I like to put One Health is into this context. I think it's relevant to isolate wildlife and to talk about wildlife as a real core part of One Health, in addition to human and animal health. And as well, all of these are within ecosystems, right? We all live somewhere. We all live within an ecological system, whether it's an urban one, suburban one, or a more natural system. And all of these systems have similar parameters. They're just maybe different levels of biodiversity or different dynamics that characterize these ecological systems. But why is it important to have wildlife in there? Well, I think that as we learn more and more about the diseases that are moving into people, and as I said earlier, wildlife diseases are often the ones that are blamed for affecting people. What we see is that actually, if you look at from an evolutionary perspective, the potential pathogens that get into people, they're actually living quite well and happily in wildlife, and they're not causing any problems to the wildlife. So many of these things that are so-called pathogens in people are actually just normal viruses that exist and don't affect the health of the wildlife themselves. And so it's only a pathogen once it leaves its normal host and moves into a different host. And I think that this is where the whole concept of blaming wildlife, well, the wildlife have had these viruses and these bacteria for many years, right? If you think about some of the, the bat-borne diseases, I mean, this is coevolution over thousands of years. Bats are not dying from Ebola, right? But when Ebola jumps into people, then we have big problems. So what's giving the opportunity for that virus to move into people? And that actually is where the problem lies. That's the interface, right? And what creates interface? The bats don't necessarily go out looking for people to infect. That's not what is, the bat is not programmed to do that, right? The bat's programmed basically to reproduce. That's about it. And if you think about it, the opportunity for these potential viruses to move, it's actually man-made or human-made opportunities that create the possibilities for these pathogens to move from their reservoir into different hosts. And so I think that rather than saying the wildlife are the problem, I would argue humans are the problem. And so One Health, this is how I remember it, four-legged stool. It's a collaborative effort of multiple disciplines to work together locally, regionally, nationally, globally to promote and ensure the health of people, of livestock, of wildlife, and the environment. So why do we need One Health? Well, one of the biggest challenges we face really is the demographics globally. If you look around the world, there are more and more people showing up every day on this earth. And what do you need to be happy on this earth? You need food, you need shelter. We often need resources that we need to build homes with or to create roads. So if you think about resource utilization, there's automatically a pressure with more people. And in particular, I just looked up a couple days ago what what's happening as far as birth to death rates. And what you can see is that the number of births is more than double the number of deaths on a given day. And if you look at it extrapolated over the year, the same ratio basically exists. And so far this year, you can see that we have 73 million more people. Okay, that's 1 year. That's 1 year of data. Imagine that, for the next 20 years. Okay, and that starts to tell you where the population dynamics are going to have a bit of impact. And when you look at where the people are most densely located in the world, there's certainly some prevalence for higher numbers of people in Southeast Asia and South Asia, particularly China and India being two of the major growth places for people. And I think that it's important to recognize that it's not just about people, okay? It's not just the overall number of people. But the other thing that needs to be considered is the socioeconomic status of the people. And if you think about this, a lot of people who are coming onto this earth in those two countries, these are two up-and-coming countries. These are two countries that are really starting to be global players in economics, in trade. And what that means is that the average person in these countries is starting to be able to afford more things financially. The GDP is going up, and then the economic ability of people to buy, the buying power of an individual is changing significantly. And when you have this many people who suddenly become middle class, you suddenly have a real change in the purchasing power. And then these two countries alone create a real interesting challenge to keep up with the actual things that people might want. And so what I think is really at the heart of a lot of the challenge we face is food, okay? If you don't have money, you tend to not eat protein, or you don't have at least livestock or fish-based protein. As soon as you start to have money, you start to be able to afford to buy meat. And that's what people want. And if you think about those two countries that I mentioned that have the highest population numbers on record for the time being, you can see that this is what they're going to be demanding. And so FAO has done some work in trying to evaluate what and project forward based on populations, what kind of food demand there will be. And I have to say here, one thing that I think is important. You know, some people would argue that even today we have enough food, enough livestock and meat to feed the world very easily. Some people would say you don't need to actually produce more food, and that what you need to do is actually just appropriate it better. It means that basically we have enough food, but because we all demand to eat any kind of product on any given day, and we always want it available at our supermarket when we go there. So what that means is that the food that's out there gets sent to all of the rich countries that can afford to eat it. And so, you know, that drains some of the other countries that might be producing the food from having it available for local consumption. And so if we as a society were more comfortable with eating more locally produced products and not demanding to eat everything we want any day of the week and have our supermarkets completely stocked with food from around the world, some would argue we don't actually need to increase food production significantly, okay? But I think that that's not the case these days, okay? And we as a society are in a habit of demanding what we want when we want it every day of the year. And so that's driven the distribution of a lot of the food. And so in light of that, probably the needs that will come online even as early as 2020 show an increase in demand for animal protein of up to 50% more. And, you know, we're talking just tons, millions of tons of meat is what we're talking about. So this is going to pose a challenge, right? When you look at where livestock densities are the greatest, you also see that we have a significant livestock density in Southeast and Eastern Asia. And you can also see, again, South Asia has some areas that are also quite dense. And so what are you doing here? Basically, you're taking a large place where there's lots of people, and now you're putting lots of animals there, okay? So what are you setting up to happen? You automatically are bringing people and animals together. And we know that when you give the pathogens the opportunity to move, they will take advantage of that. They will jump. And so just by looking at just the distribution of human and animal densities, in this case, livestock densities, we're already setting up for a potential problem just based on the distribution of what we see. And so if you think about what's going to be the repercussions, we need more aquaculture, more livestock, more farmed wildlife, which maybe you don't think about too much for consumption here, although I know there is some, but not maybe a main source. There are other parts of the world where this is really a relied upon protein source. And then obviously the wheats, grains, vegetables, fruits. Well, some of the challenges that we face is that we are going to deal with agricultural intensification. So more animals being produced in the same amount of land, or we're going to talk about expansion. And if we need more space filled up by farms, it's going to lead to other encroachment issues. And obviously the natural resource consumption is going to be associated. So we have, I think, some challenges ahead of us. If we take a look at pathogen evolution, what I'd like to suggest is that it's actually taking place really in two different sectors, one the natural setting and one in the farm setting. And these are, in a way, two biological processes that are ongoing. So if you think about bacteria or viruses that are in the environment, they face very significant changes right now and need to continue to adapt to survive. Just a few of the simple changes that they are challenged with right now. One could be, for example, the amount of antimicrobials or antibiotics that are out in the environment. This is sort of an unprecedented global issue right now. We've never seen the high volume that we see in the environment now. And that, just by definition, puts different pressures on some of the bugs and pathogens and bacteria that we're dealing with in an ecological setting. If you think about contaminants, whether it's mercury or copper or any of the other heavy metals or pesticides in the environment, these are all having a role on evolution of the different viruses and bacteria that are out there. If you then go to a farm setting and you think about intensified farming, You obviously know probably a bit more about the way production occurs. And this, whether it's vaccines or whether it's antibiotics in feed, or even the food or the water that's treated, all of these things are creating some form of evolution of the potential pathogens that are in these systems. And when we see what's happening sort of at these two separate systems, sometimes they stay separate depending on the animals that we're producing. But in other cases, and if we talk about avian influenza and poultry production and the role of wild birds, which we'll talk a lot more about later, what we see is actually what is evolving in a farm and what is evolving in nature actually has an opportunity to interact, right? Because we have livestock-wildlife interface at some point during bird migration or in open farming systems, which there are many, many of them, or even in backyard farming systems where people own just maybe a handful of animals, but they come into contact with wildlife. So I think that we see these evolutionary processes happening, in particular with the influenza, the high-path H5N1 strain. What we think actually happened as a scenario is very much this interface of the two sectors. And so we know that wild waterfowl are the reservoir for all the low-path avian influenzas. And we believe that the low path moved into the poultry sector and then mutated and became high path and then spilled back out into the wild populations. And I think that this is, what most of us believe is sort of the story, the etiology of what took place. And I think what's very interesting about that is that if you think about the original H5N1 HPAI, high path avian influenza, it was first detected actually in 1997 in people in Hong Kong, okay? That's way before we saw the events that started taking place in the wild bird population. And it was only in 1997 that we had a really, in 2005 when we had our first real large wild bird event. And this wild bird event was in Qinghai Lake, China. And bar-headed geese, as well as other waterfowl, were significantly affected. And we had, probably 7,000 to 8,000 wild birds died in that large-scale event at Qinghai Lake. And what's interesting, and this is something that I think also demonstrates an evolutionary process, is that in that first year where we had spillover into the wild birds, we had huge mortality, 7,000 to 8,000 birds in one event. In 2006 to 2008, we had some smaller events, but they were in the low thousands, okay? Maybe 1,000 to 2,000 wild birds were dying. And now we hardly ever see wild bird die-offs that are more than maybe 10 to 20 to 30, maybe 50 birds maximum, okay? So what's different? Either the birds have adapted or the virus has also changed and become less pathogenic to the wild birds. If you think about it, if you really think about it, I mean, a good virus doesn't kill its host, right? A good virus actually figures out how to survive inside its host and continue to spread from one animal to the next and throughout a population, and it keeps moving around. That's a good virus. A bad virus kills its host. So, if the hosts all die, if you're infecting it, then you're going to die too as the virus. So I think that we could be seeing, just in this short time frame, clearly some adaptation of the virus to survive in these wild birds. And so we really see a different story in wildlife now, specifically on the H5N1. So the other thing that I think is important to talk about is the drivers of emerging infectious diseases. And there's been a lot of work. I know that Peter Daszak was here a few months ago and spoke to and probably spoke about some of the work that PREDICT has done to look at drivers of disease emergence and emerging zoonoses. And I think that whether you look at their data from PREDICT or even some of the more historical work that's been done, they all lead us to some of the same conclusions. And so I'm not going to read through all of the detailed examples. You can have the slides to look at later. But I think that modifications to natural habitats is a big issue. Changes in agricultural practices is also contributing to a large extent to the emergence that we deal with. And then finally, human behavior. And this is the one that I think is probably least addressed. And perhaps probably it's least addressed because it might be the most difficult one to deal with. How do you change human behavior? And that's you know, this starts to bring us to the types of people we need to be working with in One Health, right? We always think natural resource managers, veterinarians, and doctors. That's sort of the standard. But actually, the people that we need on board with us are the anthropologists, the sociologists, the people that can do behavior change work, or can first evaluate why people make the decisions that they make and what they do, and then how do we work with them to adjust their behavior to be less risk prone. And that's a really hard thing to do, because if we have to tell them that they should be doing something differently than how they've been doing it for the last 1,000 years. And this is really part of the challenge that we face in One Health. But I think it's a really important one for us to continue to work on addressing. The other thing I want to mention just real quickly is that you know, people are always quick to say wild birds are spreading disease as they fly and migrate. But I think that what we're becoming much more cognizant of is the dynamic of cross-border movements and value chains, and understanding the price indices that drive trade of animals and animal products. The economics of it, actually, in and of itself is very much a driver for spreading diseases. And you can see we're doing some work in China and in Viet Nam, trying to understand, for example, spent hen value chains. And spent hen value chains, you would think, why on earth would you care about a spent hen from China? And I often, you know, when I first went to Asia and started working there, I really didn't understand it until I started to talk to the ladies that own the soup shops on the streets of Hanoi. And I would always go with somebody who could speak Vietnamese, and I always ask, and they're all women, they're never men, they're always women, and I would ask them, where do you get your chicken from? And they would always be afraid to answer, because here I am, a foreign guy, asking them a strange question. And then if they wouldn't answer, I would go to the second question, and I would just say directly, do you prefer to use a spent hen from China or a spent hen from Vietnam to make your soup? And without question, they all wanted a spent hen from China. And so I would just ask them, why? And their answer was that the soup tastes better. Okay, and I have no way to validate this, and I've never done a double-blind taste with a chicken soup from Vietnam versus a chicken soup from China. But all I can tell you is that at a cultural level, the Vietnamese women who make soup on the street, they want a Chinese bird. Okay? And as we started to explore it more and more, what we came to learn is that actually they could get chickens from China, spent hens, at a lower price than they could get spent hens from Vietnam, which also was really a mind-boggling thing, right? You look at this map, you can see China and Hanoi, that's a fair distance, right? And if you look at the map, you know, this is just from the border, that's a fair distance, but do you see where these birds are coming from? This is northern China, and these birds are coming all the way down to the border to get into Vietnam. So the value chain goes, you know, all the way through China and then down and then into Vietnam. It's just mind-boggling that that could be financially more efficient for a woman who wants to buy a chicken to make a soup in Hanoi. But nonetheless, that is the way it is. And so, you know, how do we change a perspective? You know, we need to obviously cook 2 soups and work with people, but imagine what it would take to really convince a Vietnamese woman who makes soup to use a Vietnamese bird, okay? We can't do that straight away. And so this is the kind of thing. how do you change that way of thinking? And that's where I think One Health needs to go next, okay? We need to get into the minds of the people that have certain traditions, behaviors, habits, or ways of thinking and understand. And I can tell you that certainly there's no doubt in my mind that price plays a role in some of the decision-making for at least the spent hen story here, but there has to be something else there. It can't just be the price. But anyway, that's something that we need to figure out. The other thing that I want to mention is the impacts of these emerging infectious diseases, right? And you can look at the disease that you want to choose, but the most important thing to remember, I think, is that these diseases are really, from the standpoint of trying to get engagement from a government, the cost of these diseases is the best way to speak to a government about why they should do One Health. Okay? If you can go in and tell them that if they have an infection, they will lose millions to billions of dollars, and we have lots of examples of millions to billions of dollars, they start to listen to you. Because if you're the Minister of Health, or the Minister of Trade, or the Minister of Agriculture, or the Minister of Tourism, you know, these are all the industries that are going to be hit when you have a big emerging event. You don't want to lose trade money. You don't want your country to lose millions to billions of dollars. And so if you can pitch it along the lines of, well, we want to prevent this from happening because we see how much money it costs other countries that have gone through the experience, that tends to get their attention. And that's one of the nice things that we have going for us, is really being able to talk about economics with the governments. And that's been something we've used to a large extent to really work with them. So I think that the One Health challenge, again, thinking about the four-legged stool, here are your four legs, but really what we face is needing to balance the needs of people and livestock and wildlife and the natural ecosystems that we want to preserve. And we do this when we know that we have an increase in global population and we really have limited natural resources to work with on this world. And so this is all happening while countries are changing their development status, right? I work in Viet Nam. The country is a completely different country than it was even 10 years ago. And they've moved from a lower income country to a middle income country. The development that's happening, the construction, the way of life is completely changing. And this is in a very tight time frame, and Vietnam is just one example of many countries going through this transition. And so we need to figure out how to accommodate for the needs that the people have and the increasing economies while at the same time thinking about preventing problems. So the Millennium Development Goals, these were targeting 2015. I think that One Health speaks very well to and is aligned very well with eradicating extreme poverty and hunger. Obviously, combating HIV, malaria, and other diseases is very much along the lines of One Health, and then also ensuring environmental sustainability. So for those of you who aren't aware, we've transitioned out of the MDGs, and now we've moved into Sustainable Development Goals. And there are more Sustainable Development Goals, but when you look at number 3, I mean, right, isn't this the essence of One Health, right? Good health and well-being. That's where we want to get to. And that's for people, but when you look at some of the other elements that really are reflective of One Health, it's not just the health of people, but we're talking about life on land, life in the water, climate. So these things very much reflect One Health, some of the elements that we've talked about in the four-legged stool. When we talk about drivers of zoonotic disease, you can see that there are a variety of different sustainable development goals that are actually the etiologies or driving some of the drivers to take place. And so I think that, you know, as we go forward, these are very much compatible with One Health. And finally, where does One Health want to go? Well, we want to have very, I guess, sustainable systems, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption, and production, obviously clean water, and so on and so forth. I think one thing that I wanted to mention is you look at this education and gender equality, and I think that these are issues that are very much linked to drivers of zoonotic disease. And I want to just take a moment to just say that, you know, from an education standpoint, why do people get exposed to potential pathogens? A lot of it has to do with a lack of awareness. People just don't know. And you may take it very much for granted, being educated here and having a good understanding of principles of disease transmission, but that's not what most people in the world understand or have ever had exposure to. We certainly have a major issue with proper education at a global level, and in particular for women. And that, in and of itself, is a major issue and challenge for us to overcome. So it's an awareness, it's knowing what is something that you should be not, you know, what puts you at risk. And clearly there would be a difference in education of men and women globally. But then the other thing is that there are certainly occupational health risks. So if you look at, for example, poultry vendors, in a lot of the countries in the world, the people who sell poultry are all women. And so what does that mean? That means they're at live animal markets every day with hundreds of birds flapping around, breathing, feces, urine, the whole thing, everywhere in front of them all day, every day of their lives. To me, that puts women at greater risk than men for avian influenza. And so I think that there are also some of these issues that could be and should be thought about and considered going forward. So how is FAO supporting One Health? Well, just so you are aware, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, we are really focused on getting rid of hunger at a global level. In particular, we support modernizing agricultural, forestry, and fishery practices. And a lot of this is, to a large extent, in support of local livelihoods, small-scale farming production, and things that we do are focused on natural resource management, sustainable agriculture. Okay, so some of these same things that we just talked about related to drivers of disease or elements of One Health, these are very much at the heart of what FAO does. So I think as an organization, we are quite compatible with the concept of moving forward with One Health. These are all the different departments that we have at FAO. And you can just see by the names, economic and social development, agriculture, natural resource management, fisheries, aquaculture, forestry. Right there, just your department names gives you a One Health program. And what we often say is that, you know, there are 3,000 to 4,000 people working at FAO just in headquarters. And probably only about 100 of them really know that they're doing One Health. And the other, you know, 3,900 of them, they're doing One Health, but they don't know it. And what I mean by that is that if we take a look at what One Health is and we look at the type of work that they're doing and who they're working with and the partnerships they've forged forward to do the work, it actually is One Health. But they don't call it One Health because they don't even know what One Health is. And so this is, I think, one of the challenges that we face at an organizational level. But I would rather it be that way, that they're doing One Health and don't know it, rather than they know what it is and they don't do it. And these are just from an animal health and focusing more on the animal health and agriculture side of things. From animal health, animal production, socioeconomics, and livelihoods, and agroecological systems and land use. These are some of the interfaces that we deal with. So you can see sort of the traditional One Health circles here, but we are very much linked to some other elements that broaden up our One Health approach. And if you look at the food cycle, if you think about food production, right? What's the first thing that happens? You need to make food for animals to eat. Okay, you're making things in the environment. You're already starting to talk about One Health just by the natural resources or the types of production systems that you have. Then that moves into to feed animals, Ultimately, it's in the food chain. We're eating it. It goes back out at waste. And then you get some interphase with natural species, wildlife, and then this feeds back into more. So, you know, FAO along the food cycle, pretty much from farm to fork in Asia, from chopsticks. This is really, for us, a food cycle-based One Health approach. Touch on a few examples in a few of the other departments. Forestry department, some of them, but I mean, if you look at the capacity building doing, they're involving veterinarians, resource managers, biologists. Right there, you've got One Health flavor in their trainings. They deal a lot with change and diseases, and obviously the One Health focus. And they also deal with human-wildlife conflict. And so this is an example. From the animal health standpoint, I think that what we aim to do is try to basically trying to establish a global health system, animal health system particularly, that can address major health threats either in animals or in people, and it uses the interphase, the wild ecosystem human interphase as sort of the approach for dealing with it. And ultimately, we're placing diseases and disease dynamic issues into the broader area of development. And so that's where we're coming from on an animal health side. And I won't kill you with all the details here, but suffice it to say there are a lot of different technical areas of work at a global level that are taking place. Probably the one point to note is these are all different global One Health meetings that have taken place. So there's lots of collaboration and One Health focus, and FAO is supporting that. There are also a series of multilateral environmental agreements. What are MEAs? So you may have heard of the CITES Treaty, which protects wildlife species that are threatened or endangered. You may have heard of the Ramsar Convention. You might have heard of any of the flyway. There's an African-Eurasian flyway partnership. There's an East Asian Australasian flyway partnership. These are all international treaties, many of them managed either by Convention of Biological Diversity or Convention of Migratory Species. And that's a part of UNEP, the UN Environmental Program. These are all things that countries are signing up to agree to support. And basically, they are committing to practice according to the treaty requirements. So Ramsar focuses on wetland preservation and preserving habitat that might be useful to wetland species, particularly migratory waterfowl. CITES is dealing with threatened and endangered species protection, and so on. The flyway partnerships are really talking about where birds need to forage and where they need to swim, and where they need for migration and stopover sites. So these are all approaches where FAO is getting involved and really trying to support and facilitate a lot of what's happening. In other areas, I think it's important to mention there's been a series of these interministerial meetings, and the most recent one happened just a few months ago in Korea. And these interministerial meetings all have had different types of declarations or outcomes. And the ministers of health and agriculture primarily are basically coming to these meetings and agreeing on approaches to go forward for dealing with infectious disease prevention and control. And so there's if you want further information about the outcomes, you can look these meetings up, and there's usually a lot of web-based resource material. But these are some key events that have been supported. At a regional level, I think that one or two regional organizations, ASEAN or SARC, these are the regional coordination mechanisms for economic growth and development. Both this one, ASEAN, is for East Asia, and SARC is more for South Asia. These involve multiple countries and basically allow us to go to one place to try to have an effect in multiple countries at one time. And so we're working with both ASEAN and SARC in the context of One Health. We also are at a more practical level dealing with different types of training programs at regional level. We have, for example, field epidemiology training programs, which is focused on veterinarians, but then we partner with the field. There's a field epidemiology training program for medics that is run to a large extent by CDC and WHO and public health partners, and we're doing the vets. And so what we're doing is bringing these two groups together for trainings and allowing epi training to occur concurrently. We also implement this WILD training. WILD is Wildlife Investigation in Livestock Disease and Public Health. We basically bring doctors, natural resource managers, and veterinarians together for really a short course on One Health where it's problem-based learning for the most part. And we do a lot of field trips and we go to sites and we evaluate. We run a lot of scenarios, tabletop exercises, things like that. And this has really been a good regional approach to raise awareness about One Health and also the value of working together with people from other sectors. We also have had a series of bats, pigs, people projects. So many of you know Nipah virus in Malaysia was a bat to pig to human transmission cycle. In Bangladesh, Nipah is directly bats to people. But anyway, we also are dealing with those types of disease issues. Ebola, in particular in the Philippines, we've worked on Ebola restin virus, which is also a virus originally in bats and made it into pigs. Fortunately, didn't have any detrimental effect really to the pigs or to people who had been exposed, and so on. So these are all regional approaches. We also work a bit on trying to identify common priority diseases for the countries in the region, and then we can develop either approaches, epidemiological ways of dealing with it, standardized lab protocols, or testing and diagnostic approaches. Moving to a national story. So I'll just talk briefly about a few things that are happening in Vietnam. Vietnam has had a lot of One Health experience. Okay, Vietnam dealt with SARS. Vietnam has had a lot of H5N1. Vietnam dealt with H1N1. We've had joint nation work, introduction of Ebola virus. We have H7N9, which is in China but threatening the country, and pandemic one. So there's a variety of actual disease issues that have forced Vietnam country to think about how to approaches. And in agriculture, a committee, a group that focuses on dealing with One Health issues. Ministry of Health, another group that basically consists of some of the same people for dealing with public health-led zoonotic events. And so you have these two working groups that basically are mandated to deal with zoonotic issues, one being more avian influenza focused, the other being broader and zoonotic. But they're both under the respective ministries ready in and of itself to show the government's commitment to dealing with One Health. Risk communication. This probably needs some of the biggest about once we can characterize it, point out where it comes from people, what we need to be able to do is transfer that information to the common people, to the people that have occupational health risk, or to others, so that they can then understand what not to do. And if you look at many of these ministries at an international, they don't necessarily have a technical person. They might have sort of a government spokesperson make a statement thing, sort of if it's a national level issue, but they don't have any technical background. So they won't have the ability to express the nuances that you want people to broadcast that's coming from your government country is watching. This is something that I think we need to and figure out to get better engagement of either Ministry of Health or Ministry of Agriculture or of Environment to actually have a technically trained person be a communications person. I think that this would really enhance the delivery of what we're doing to a very local level to allow the best response or the best prevention of and on the national level, they're doing a lot of assessments. And so when H7N9 started to surge in China, and this was Viet Nam, because we knew a lot of unofficial movement, and later we went back and actually implemented Vietnam, what the risk would come from movements of birds. But when the virus finally got to which is finally at the border, this is when we still heightened alert discussion in culture, and we said, it's on your border now. Okay, there's a few problems away. We had some room, but now it's on your border. We really think it's time to take action. And so as a result of using a lot of the science-based information that we had about what was happening in China, we were basically able to work with the Vietnamese government and set up a really nice surveillance program. We ended up doing surveillance in all the northern provinces right on the border, and a really intensive program. Every 2 weeks, we're collecting a lot of samples looking for the disease. The government did a good job at closing the border so that a lot of the unofficial movement of poultry wasn't taking place. And there was really also the development of a H7N9 and other influenzas contingency plan that outlined what we were going to do at live bird markets if we detected the virus, the different requirements for cleaning, disinfecting. So I think that, you know, this really shows that with some advocacy and the right science to base recommendation on to the government, if you have that right opportunity, then they really have taken action. And this, for me, was a really great success story of how H7N9 so far has not been detected in Vietnam. And so we believe that the efforts that were taken were very good. Other diseases that are being dealt with on a One Health, both Ministry of Health, Ministry of Agriculture, dealing with these diseases together are listed here. And they also are part of legislation now that's been passed in Vietnam. So they have a circular, it's called Circular 16, and it really is legislation that says the Ministry of Health will work with the Ministry of Agriculture on these diseases. And that's really, I mean, you can't really get any better One Health collaboration, at least between the health sectors. Now the next challenge would be to bring in the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment, or some of the other sectors that we think need to be sort of the rounded out group for One Health. The Emergency Operations Center, this is now very much like you would envision for dealing with forest fires or other types of hurricane. Now an Emergency Operations Center set up within the Ministry of Health that is set up for doing both disease work and non-disease emergencies. There's also a 5-year plan for zoonotic diseases in the country that's been developed by the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Health together, and so on. So I think that we've come a long way, and Vietnam's really a good example of some very good progress on One Health as a middle-income country. Now, I want to start to change the subject a little and talk a little bit more about some of the cultural issues. And, you know, we have, you know, a very long history, in particular in this part of the world, in Southeast Asia and East Asia, on raising animals very closely together with people and wildlife. And these some of these places, for example, there's a place called Poyang Lake in China, where in Poyang Lake there are literally millions of domestic duck that are raised. There are also high hundreds of thousands of farmed wild birds. There are also pigs, again, in the thousands. And then you jump back up to millions for people, okay? And during migratory bird season, Poyang Lake is the southernmost area where wetland birds migrate to. So they come from the Palearctic, they come from Russia, Mongolia, and they stop at Poyang Lake for overwintering. So then you also bring in more than 1 million free-ranging wild waterfowl. So to me, Poyang Lake represents sort of the perfect storm if you wanted to talk about influenza inputs into one big system. And for those of you who know anything about the initial avian influenza high path strain, there are genetic signals that came from Poyang Lake in the viruses that were isolated in Qinghai Lake in China. And so, you know, it wasn't so surprising, actually, that many people thought that the virus might have actually evolved right from Poyang Lake. And in light of this combination of diversity of viruses going into one big soup from the various sectors, it wouldn't be too surprising to imagine that that plays part of the story. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. But I just want to say, from a One Health standpoint, I think that we know that we have lots of science that can be applied to changing human behavior, but human behavior change is going to be the big challenge for us. And that's because there are many cultural practices that we need to accommodate for in suggesting changes to human behavior. And we can't completely disregard what's been happening and what is part of a local culture. And we need to understand it and then help guide a slight change or some differences sort of in a slower phased work. And that's I think, something that's a challenge. I give you a quick example. Indonesia, right? When they got bird flu, all of a sudden millions of dollars were flowing into Indonesia, really just millions and millions of dollars on a monthly basis. And after several years of work, there were a lot of discussions about whether they had made progress on solving the problem. And they still had endemic H5N1 influenza. And, you know, nobody would probably ever say it sort of on the record. But actually, when you to people and start to ask them, well, you know, all this money, all these resources, how come we haven't made any progress? You know, what do you think? What should we do? How should we change things? You know, and they said, and, you know, I was talking to a colleague there, and he said to me, you know, this is just my personal opinion, he said, but think about this. Avian influenza that everyone's worried about from the West, right? Worried about this pandemic, it's killed a couple hundred people. We have a couple hundred people die from diarrhea every month, sometimes every week, sometimes in a day. The same number of people you're worried about dying over a series of years have died in one day from diarrhea. Now, how do you think we receive the idea of doing something about influenza if we're not also doing something about diarrhea? Okay? And so I think that really, to me, it's really struck me. You know, it's good that we want to support a lot of developing countries and deal with the issues that we're thinking about in a globalized world that are very quick to move and spread. But at the same time, if we're going to be successful, we also need to understand what the needs are of the local people and either address them first and then move on to these other issues, or address both of them concurrently. And that's something you really need to be aware of and think about if you're working outside of your own cultural context. So the role of wild birds. So in our program at FAO, we dealt with 3 angles of wild birds, 3 parts of the story. Basically, we were trying to figure out what their role was in the H5HPAI story. And we did a lot of surveillance. We would go out and catch just hundreds and thousands of wild birds, sample them, and test them for avian influenza. And the project, we were doing work in Africa, we were doing work in the Middle East, we were doing work in Asia. And so we had a lot of sampling sites and collected, you know, hundreds of thousands of samples. And at the end of the day, very few, you know, literally a handful, had any signals of H5N1. And the ones that we found were H5N1 were already sick or already dead. And they weren't really the healthy free-ranging wild birds. They were already affected by the disease. And I think that if you look at all the global surveillance that's been done on free-ranging wild birds, you're hard-pressed to find many positive, healthy birds. Okay, the positive samples all come from sick or dead birds. And so that was the way it used to be. You know, that was when we were starting to work with the virus. I think that, you know, also recognize that part of the challenge might also have been the fact that wild bird populations are so large. And if you look at the percentage of birds that you were sampling, you were never actually sample size to represent sort of a population of birds. You could never get that sample size. Too many birds. And in light of the prevalence of the virus, what was known, enough to know that it meant really wasn't in the wild bird population. And I would say we couldn't prove that, right? We just know from our subset of sampling that we didn't get. And our group, as well as many groups that were doing this surveillance, also found the same results primarily. In addition to doing the surveillance program, we also implemented a larger scale effort to track outbreaks and to collect samples from outbreak events and then get those viruses sequenced. And then we also use satellite tags to start to evaluate habitat use and migration. And we really were trying to understand when an event, when an outbreak was happening, was the wild bird in that physical place at the time to have been part of the story? Were they transmitting the virus, or was the virus moving in another way? And if you look carefully, these birds actually have transmitters on them. There's a unit right on this bird. Just harness to attach the antennas, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment. So this is over the last. These are all the influenza events that have been documented. These are domestic birds in red, wild birds in green. You can see, you know, this is a disease dealing with lots of events taking place. The interesting thing to mention is that, you know, you said poultry events, members, but I'll tell you that if you looked at where your largest poultry density, you're basically covering the same area. So much of a surprise that where you have the most amount of poultry is where you're getting large, high concentration of your events. When you start to take a look at shorter time frames, so this is the last 5 years, what you basically can see is that despite all the concerted efforts to deal with and eradicate which is, you know, millions and millions of dollars of input, we basically have a disease epidemic in persistent in a lot of Southeast and East Asia. And when you start to look then at a little more detail, when you start to subtype and look at clades of viruses, you can also see that there's some different distributions based on the clade and the subtype. And so what we have seen is that over time, this map has changed. Every year we remake this map and try to look at which clade and which virus is where. See, over time, some viruses move in, other viruses, they come out. And then those viruses are no longer in the mix, and then the next year there might be another that comes together, and then it comes in, it moves, and then it pushes other viruses out. So this is a living system. This is a constant evolution that we're witnessing and monitoring. And wild bird telemetry. So this is the sort of the summary slide of all the marked birds, and you see the tracks of all these. We've got is some in the African Eurasian flyway. a lot of work that was done in the Central Asian flyway, and then some in the East Asia, Australasia flyway. And to a large extent, this was really an FAO project collaboration with USGS. And so it's really, I don't know of projects that have put out 500 transmitters in such a short time with a really focused effort. So we really had collaborative opportunities. I mean, think about in every country, we basically needed to work with at least 2 ministries and a whole just and do captures and sampling and get samples to labs and work with the natural resource managers for permits, but the vets for getting the samples. And so each of these was like a 50-person project on top of how many countries we had to deal with. But what did we learn? Well, one thing that we learned is that we also needed to look at value chains. We shouldn't look at just wild birds as potential sources. And so you can see, if you start to understand value chains and the movement of poultry also places, you start to be able to, as you look, you find more and more movements cross-border. So already we had some understanding that cross-border movements weren't probably restricted just to wild birds, but that there was some trade involved. And from the earlier slide that I showed you of the spent hen movements across China. So in the beginning, we started to see outbreaks in some of the poultry, and these were also, the background map is also the density. The darker maroon is the highest density poultry, and then we had outbreaks. And as we went on in time, I mentioned that we had some information about some of the being linked to Poyang Lake, but the big die-off that happened in wildlife was over here in Qinghai province. And the question always was, did a bird from here that had that virus fly over to here? That was the hypothesis. That's what everyone believed was going on. And so we marked a group of birds, some of them at Qinghai Lake and some of them at Poyang Lake, and then we tracked them. And this is what the telemetry data is, right? And you see Qinghai Lake, very distinct north-south down into Myanmar, some into India and Bangladesh, but primarily Myanmar routing, or on the northern slope of the Himalaya, they would stop. And then for the Poyang Lake, nothing south, right? So this is, again, this is where I was saying that everything stops to overwinter. It doesn't make it down towards Viet Nam. They stop. And up north, they went up basically to the edge of the Bering Strait and would stop up there for breeding. And so here you see very clearly, could this have been the story? Well, based on our efforts, we don't really think that happened. So we think something else happened. The best guess, and again, it can't be confirmed, is that probably during migration, I mean, we obviously didn't mark all the birds, but we think that probably a lot of these birds also nest up in this area, all in the Palearctic. And we also think some of these birds also nest in here. And so what we think is probably, if there is really a link between these places, it's not through this mechanism, but it's northern migration, breeding up here, and then after breeding, a bird brought it back home to Qinghai. And we think that the mixing and the transfer of virus is happening during breeding season up in the Palearctic. So some of these birds coming back down this way, other birds after the season. The next set of work we did was out of the corner of Mongolia, right near the Russian border. And in this, we marked a group of whooper swans. And whooper swans, we suspected were flying not straight north-south, but we knew there were large whooper swan populations overwintering in South Korea. And sure enough, we had a lot of birds head right down to the Korean Peninsula. And interestingly, right as the birds were migrating into Korea, we started to see outbreaks of H5N1 in Korea. So we thought for sure, okay, we have some real evidence of the movement of the virus in. But then when we started to look carefully at the timestamp of the outbreaks and the time when our birds were getting there, they weren't correlated. And so we actually were a little bit confused by this, and even to this day, I don't know how strongly we have this link. Still a bit of a weak link because the temporal dynamics were very different. So the birds had arrived a month before. So if it is related to the wild birds in this story, the question is, where was the virus for the 1 month, right? The birds get here, and then a month later, outbreaks start to happen. We don't know where the virus was for that month. So anyway, that's discrepancies for really associating the migration with the outbreaks there. Started to do more and more work. We then started to get a little more fancy in what we were doing. So originally we were just looking at movement patterns and outbreaks, and then we started to take virus sequences and look at the phylogeography and try to track the specific genome of the virus as it moved up and down the flyways. And this is where we really got a lot closer to the answer, because we were able to actually show during northern migration in particular that as the birds moved north for breeding, we could also then track the exact sequence going north along that flyway with the birds, and outbreaks were occurring. So this really was to really showing both spatial and temporal linked with virological data that demonstrates their role. So we have some knowns. Wild waterfowl, the low path reservoir, but it's difficult to get positive from sampling. The HPAI exposure trials, this was done in lab setting. Wild birds can be asymptomatic for 2 to 5 days, and our telemetry data showed that they can travel hundreds of kilometers during migratory season in 2 to 5 days. So the theoretical movement, if they were carrying virus, and then they could be shedding it. And then we also finally showed that the viruses we think are transmitting back in wild birds and domestic birds. And the unknowns, we don't really know the exact mechanism that's transferring between wild and domestic, because nobody's been able to really document that at a farm or in a domestic setting. And we also don't know very well whether introductory events are one part of the story or whether spread is a different part of the story. So we don't have a good distinction between those two. And then finally, vaccination, right? A lot of these domestic birds are being vaccinated, but we don't have good information on what evolutionary changes are happening in viruses as birds get vaccinated. And then the unknowns, there may be other processes or risk factors. Outbreaks that are reported, we may not be getting the full story. Are there really 100 more outbreaks than what are officially reported? And this is always a challenge for us to manage that kind of information. And environmental persistence for the various clades is also something that has not been well studied yet. And finally, cultural traditions, buying birds at live bird markets. You know, can this be changed? And could this affect then the outcomes? So I want to just switch my last slide and show you a video. I'll sort of ask you a question at the end to see if you were paying attention to the video. This is a video I took just last week. It's of a group of birds that are in An Giang province in Viet Nam, and these birds are moved onto a boat to be transferred to a new rice field for migration, for foraging. Can you hear the volume or not? About One Health here. Any things that you should be concerned about? So this is a flock of 2,000 ducks, which sort of on a food raising duck standard This is just kind of an average size flock. I've seen flocks that are 40 and 50,000 ducks. But you see the boats that they take. These ducks have obviously paid the premium price for this trip. They're on the top deck because they're actually, and these are the top deck boats. So this is like the cruise where you get the highest price seats. Anyway, I think this really, these birds. If you the slide, I just want to point one thing out from a One Health standpoint, right? You see those rice fields in the background? Those birds, which are domestic birds, are swimming all day long. And guess what else is out there? All the migratory birds. So in our lifetime, I can guarantee in many years we will never get rid of this wildlife livestock benefit. And so what we need to do is figure out how to manage the situation. With that, I stop. Thank you for your attention. I know I was a little bit long, but hopefully you
Opportunity to see the bigger picture. I think because of time, we're probably going to, are there any burning questions? Dr. Newman will be here for a while, or at least if anyone has questions now, or we'll just put on the lights and you're welcome to come up and interact with them. Can we go ahead? You have a question back there?
You've been talking a lot about how we're going to have to intensify agriculture for livestock and such, and I know the FBO has projected that the demand in meat is going to way outpace the growth in the human population. Is it realistic that we can keep up that trend in demand, or at some point do we have to, like on a cultural level, try to encourage them to develop communities not eat as much meat, or is that something that's even possible?
Well, the latter part of your question, can we demand society stop eating so much meat? I would pose that to you as a challenge for you to address, right? I'm trying to figure out why the Vietnamese soup ladies want a Chinese chicken, because that's in their brains and that's in their culture and that's what they believe. And so my challenge to you is, can you really change the demand that developed countries have to have any kind of food available to them on every day in their supermarket? I mean, think about what that would take, right? I'm not saying it's impossible per se. Okay. Sure. Sure. I mean, I think, look, I think eating locally is very much, I think it's a good option. I think it result in the movement of livestock having a much smaller carbon footprint. I think that's good from a climate perspective. I think that's good from food security standpoint at local communities. They would have access to things that maybe get moved elsewhere. So anyway, I think that's a challenging issue. It's one that society needs to sort of address and deal with. Are we ready to make a change? I don't know either.
You mentioned a couple times the use of wildlife in traditional medicine. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
You're saying wildlife use in traditional medicine? Yeah. So a lot of wildlife parts or byproducts are used in some traditional medicines. And so there are certain cultural practices that lead to farming certain wildlife species. One very well-known example is the use of bear bile. And so there are actually bears that are out there that are cannulated so that their bile is collected on a regular basis. And this is believed to have medicinal value to have bear bile. And so, this is an example. I mean, that's probably one of the hardest examples to share with you because of the sort of the ethics of it all, but nonetheless, there are many other examples of animals or animal products or parts. Shark's fin soup, right? Some people believe eating shark fin in your soup is really good for your health. And so these are the sorts of things that, these are thousands of years of tradition, right? People have been doing this forever. So how do you go in there and get them to think differently about practicing that behavior? Well, I do it. My parents did it. My grandparents did it. This is our tradition, and this makes us healthy. And it's hard to prove them wrong. It's hard to say to them, no, that doesn't really affect your health, because you need some science to start to be able to talk about it. And for many years, they have a tradition of doing it that way. So it's really, this is where some of the sociology, anthropology, and getting inside an understanding of cultural issues is going to be part of the changes that we need to make to mitigate some of the impacts that we're seeing. Please.
You mentioned that within the FAO realm, you've got 3,000 people working there, and only 100 understand One Health. And I wonder if, and there's some movement towards using the term global health rather than One Health, because to engage the public, in this room, we probably get it, One Health. But with the public, I just don't know One Health if that really engages as much as the terminology of global health, because that involves everything, the whole globe, and everything that's involved in every system that interacts. I wonder if we could maybe improve the grasp of the idea of everything is connected with regard to disease propagation and transmission.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think the challenge we have is that sometimes we get very caught up in using the term One Health. And at one point, there were even copyright issues, trademark issues surrounding some of the words that describe this. And I'm okay to use global health. And I think that probably the people that are not trying to own it or not trying to say it's their trademark or their issue, but are more sort of open and really actually caring about the bigger picture focus, probably would be okay with another term. But actually, I do think One Health, believe it or not, has gotten very significant traction in the last 10 years. I mean, it's come alive. It's living a life of its own. I mean, maybe it's not as complete as we'd like it to be, but I think that our job, if we understand it and we get it, our job is to further advocate and share. And same thing with my managers all the time. I'm trying to help them understand more easily. And I think that will be a constant thing, because you'll always run into people who don't know what One Health is. But I don't get bothered by it, because I think more of the bottom line is the big picture vision for what we want to be doing. Yeah. But I think, your point's well taken. Global health might speak to people. Sure.
And you say One Health, and they say, and you say global health, oh, you mean disease throughout the world?
Right. That's right. Hey, if it works for you, use it. As long as we get the work done, don't matter what we call it. Good.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you on behalf of all the groups involved.
Thank you very much. All right, and I'm happy to stick around if people have other questions. So thank you.
I enjoyed things that really fit.
Okay.
And you said it well.
Well, thank you.
I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
That was really good.
Pleasure.
Nice. Audra, there's an email from Dr. Logan that his flight's been delayed and she may not be here by morning. So I'm just thinking,
Question.
Yeah.
Bernardo,
Okay.
fourth year veterinary student. So I'm going into animal, production agriculture.